Welcome to this seminar organized by SNS and the Swedish House of Finance at the Stockholm School of Economics. For those of you who were here in the spring, I said it was organized by SNS and CESifo. It's the same organizers. We just changed the name of one of the organizers to Swedish House of Finance. And when I was involved in starting this seminar series many years ago by now, and one of the ambitions I had was to bring more debate on European matters into the Swedish discussion. I felt Sweden was a bit too much sort of on the outside looking in and not really engaging in the European debates. And we've been doing this for some time. I think we've improved, but I don't think we're really good enough sort of in being active in discussions or debates on European matters. So for that reason, I'm particularly happy to have this seminar this morning about the future of the EU and the EMU. And as you all know, I mean, these are times of change with the Brexit and with the group of non-EU members, EMU members of the EMU decreasing significantly when the UK leaves, and sort of what will that mean for Sweden, and what will that mean for how the EU will work in the future. So these are important and challenging topics. And we will have an hour and a half, provided that I don't talk too much now, to discuss this. And here with us, we have Monsieur Professor Jean Pisani-Ferry, who is Commissioner General of the France Stratégie, the French Prime Minister's planning policy, and also a Professor of Economics at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. And he will make an introduction in 30 minutes on these matters, and after that, KAROLINA EKHOLM, also a Professor of Economics. There will be lots of Professors of Economics on the stage this morning, and Secretary of State. Carolina will comment on the Swedish position and attitude in these matters. And the third Professor of Economics, LARS CALMFORS, will talk primarily about the EMU and sort of what we can do to reform the EMU. So you are very welcome. I'm looking forward. Yeah, and we will go for 15 more minutes than normally. We typically end 9:15. We will end 9:30 this morning to give you more time for comments and questions. And those are very much encouraged. You don't have to dress it up as a question. You can sort of say what you feel. It can be a comment or a statement. It doesn't have to be a question. Once more, very much welcome. Please, Monsieur Pisani-Ferry, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm extremely pleased to be here today and to have this opportunity for presenting my views, but also for the debate, because over the years I've been frequently reading contributions on European matters and on EMU from this country, from SNS, from LARS, and I think that it's an excellent opportunity, really, to discuss at a crucial moment for all of us. You mentioned that I'm both a professor and an official. What I'm going to say is perhaps closer to the academic view than to the official view. I think that's the nature of the debate that we want to have. I should perhaps start. I'm going to talk mostly about EMU. I'm going to perhaps start with a few words about Brexit, because it has occupied all of us over summer, thinking about the consequences and how to deal with it. Obviously, it's no good news, but it's no good news not only because of the shock, but for other reasons. It means, first of all, I think, that the sort of perception of irreversibility that there has been on the continent for 60 years, that there was one way. We were discussing how to integrate, but not the principle of it. And now the discussion on the principle of it is inevitably there. and will remain with us, and how to deal with it will be difficult. Now, it also means a weaker Europe, and I think we have to face it exactly at a moment where we would need to be stronger for the reasons having to do with the external threat, with the internal threats also. We have to recognize that. So we should be strengthening regionally and globally, and we are inevitably weakening. So some people might be tempted to say, well, at least it will make life easier for the rest of the EU members, because there will be a disagreement gone. I'm not sure it's true. I think that the British contribution to a number of debates has been positive. The balance that it created also has been positive, for all the difficulties and all the disagreements. I think also they brought a culture on a number of policy issues that was and has been a very useful contribution. So how to deal with it? I see two risks, and I think we should be dealing with both risks. The first risk is to be dragged into a sort of undisciplined series of ad hoc agreements that would contribute to increase the risk of unraveling of the whole EU. So that's something that's very present in the mind of some of the countries, including mine, who are preparing for the discussion with the Brits, and when they trigger the discussion by triggering Article 50. And I think that's a serious risk we have to deal with. But we shouldn't forget the second risk. And the second risk is to destroy economic integration and to affect common prosperity for us, the EU, and for the UK, by destroying too much of the links that have, over the years, created this prosperity. These links economic links should be preserved. And I think we have to find a way, and it's certainly a very narrow path, to avoid both risks and to find how to preserve integration, economic integration, without, obviously, the political integration that went with it, with the EU. There is no off-the-shelf solution to this problem. In the British debate, there has been a lot of mention of the Norway option and the Canada option and the Switzerland option, and you name it. But I don't think they are appropriate to deal with the issue of the UK. The UK is a big country, is a country with a major contribution in some sectors. It's not going just to accept to take EU laws as given and copy-paste them into its own legislation. So we have to find creative solutions to deal with that. And perhaps I think I will say about Brexit, we should not be dragged into the discussion without a vision of what we want to achieve. The risk is this discussion is going to be terribly messy because of so many issues we have no experience about, what it means, what we want to discuss, etc. We need to start from a clear view of the goal, and then address the difficult issues of the negotiation. But at present, there is no clarity as regards the goal, and I think so. To clarify that on both sides is important. Now, as I said, I wanted to, and I thought, also in view of what was initially envisaged and also the discussion we want to have, I wanted to focus more on the Eurozone because we still have quite a lot of work to do, and I'd like to give my view on what we need to do. I would like to divide the issue into sort of three parts. One part is the infrastructure of a functioning monetary union. So what kind of economy we need to make the Eurozone more functional and therefore more prosperous. The second is a sort of the policy principles and the institutions. So how to organize it. And the third is how to deal with the legacy issue. And the legacy issues, it's this sort of long shadow of the past, including the past mistakes. And I think it's useful to distinguish the three. On the first, the infrastructure, I would say it's, at least in principle, it's fairly simple. I mean, what we need to make the Eurozone work, what we need to do to make our economies work, and what we need to do to make the EU work is basically the same. So there is no tension there. I'm speaking here of the growth potential. I'm speaking of economic resilience, responsive labour markets, sound banking systems, sustainable public finances. I'm speaking of, obviously, of reforms. So there is no contradiction whatsoever. That doesn't mean that it's easy to achieve these goals, but at least in terms of principles, there is no difference. And I think that's important because there is also so often the perception that the domestic agenda and the European agenda are in contradiction. They're not. There may be political contradiction, but in terms of the substance of what we should be achieving, I think there is no contradiction there. There is more difficulty on the sort of template. If we look back, if we start from where we were when the crisis erupted and where we are now, I think we've got to recognize that a lot has been done, but at the same time that we don't have yet in place the sort of set of rules, institutions, principles that would fundamentally address the problems we've been facing. So what has been done, perhaps it's always useful to remember what has been done, is not negligible, far from it. The crisis, I'm not speaking of the way the crisis was managed. The way the crisis was managed, and speaking in front of Jens Henriksson, who was, we always remember when he came from the IMF, and he told me at Bruegel, I was at Bruegel at the time, he told me this crisis is going to be the European crisis. And it was back in 2009, I suppose. I remember, yeah. And at the time, everybody thought this crisis is going to be the U.S. crisis, and Europe would sail safely out of it. And he realized, also because you were working with the Baltic countries, how deep the problem we would be facing in Europe. So we made a lot of mistakes in the management of the crisis, in the pace of reaction, in the nature of the reaction, but nevertheless, something was achieved. And I think we can distinguish different dimensions. The first was the crisis management. And the crisis management with the creation of the ESM and the creation of the initiation of the principle of the OMT by the ECB. That's largely complete. I think the question here is whether the ESM should be turned into a genuine European Monetary Fund, meaning an institution that would have more autonomy, better accountability, but that would perform essentially the same role in crisis countries. The fact that the assistance was in fact micromanaged by the ministers, and in some cases by the head of state and government, playing the role of mid-level bureaucrats, equivalent to mid-level bureaucrats in the IMF, without proper accountability, without the Commission having any say as a body on the principle of and the operation of assistance, without Parliament being at all involved. I think that was not something reasonable to do, and I think this should be corrected. But on the principle of it, we have a crisis management in place. Now, the second leg has been the strengthening of surveillance with the whole set of new legislation, with the new treaty, as regards fiscal surveillance, as regards economic surveillance, as regards macro-financial surveillance. So essentially, we sort of rolled out legislation in response to the crisis. I think it's disappointing. The size of the legislation has gone from 30 pages before the crisis to 120 pages, but the effectiveness of these additional 90 pages is very limited. Why? I think we have a fairly more intrusive, technically complicated body of legislation. We have created a lot of complexity that is intractable certainly for virtually all members of parliament, most ministers. The joke in Brussels is that there is only one person who knows what is in the new legislation. And the worrying thing is that when you mention that to someone in Brussels, everybody gives you the same name. So it's actually one person. This person exists. The traction, the effectiveness of a system like that is bound to be very limited. So what to do? I think the direction is towards more decentralization of fiscal discipline. By decentralization, I mean having domestic institutions that work in accordance with common principles, that work in favor and in favor of strengthening fiscal responsibility at domestic level, that work at a network under the same set of principles, but that are much more part of the domestic policy system, have much more granularity, much more ability to work with the policy system as it functions, according to its calendar, according to its procedures. And I think that, and I think you have written also in this direction quite a lot. The creation of the fiscal councils, the treaty actually, and the six-pack includes this push for national fiscal councils. The creation of national fiscal councils, the creation of what is called productivity councils, having been called before competitiveness councils, but that's the same principle, domestic institutions that are going to deal with this issue of competitiveness at national level. I think this is a good, useful innovation, and the way to go is really to strengthen these institutions. So what does it mean to strengthen such institutions? That means more incentives for government to strengthen them at domestic level. So essentially giving more leeway, more autonomy to national government in the operation of the surveillance, the fiscal surveillance and the economic surveillance to countries that have put in place good institutions and strong institutions. This means the sort of hub and spoke functioning. We are going to be told in a few days, I suppose, the composition of the fiscal board at EU level. I'm not sure that the sort of the legal basis for the fiscal board is perfect, but at least this will create sort of a hub and spoke model. We have this hub and spoke model, for example, for competition policy. I mean, for competition policy, it was initially very centralized. It has become decentralized. We have competition courts working on the same principle, and it does work. And it means LARS CALMFORS has written better legal protection. I think that's part of the answer. So I think that's more to do, and I think not a change in philosophy, but really there is ambiguity between centralization and decentralization. I think we should choose for more decentralization. Now there is a question of banking union, which was the third big change, the third big achievement in the management of the crisis. And this was really a watershed, because back in 2012, this was this extraordinary and extremely fast recognition that at the core of the problem, there was this link between banks and sovereigns, and that there was a sort of systemic deficiency, not only a deficiency in terms of implementation or effectiveness, but really in terms of the core principles, that this neglect of finance and this neglect of the weakness of banks and sovereigns as a consequence of their interdependence and the lack, the inevitable lack of support provided by the central bank to the sovereign in a monetary union, that called for a systemic response. It was a hard choice to make, because it was a sort of trilemma at the time. And the answer could have been more fiscal union. It could have been more of a support given by the central bank, a sort of getting rid of the no monetary financing and providing support by the central bank. Or, I mean, getting rid of the no monetary financing is a bit too much, but sort of accepting that there are limits to this strict definition of this rule. And in the end, what appeared to be the solution is to go for the banking union. Banking union means essentially protecting states, sovereigns from banks, and protecting banks from sovereigns. So it creates sort of a conduit for private risk sharing, and it's in this respect, it's really a systemic response. The problem we are facing is that the agenda hasn't been really completed. If you look at the degree to which banks are still exposed to the sovereigns, it is a bit lower than it was in 2012, but it's definitely higher than it was before the crisis. So, in fact, this link hasn't been really broken. And the fact that we have piled up a series of layers of response by having the supervision, having the resolution scheme, etc., is only effective to the extent that in the market there is an expectation that the catastrophic risk of having to shoulder the consequences of a major failure is not there anymore. So we have to think on these issues starting from the extreme case, not starting from the sort of normal case. Things can work in the normal case, but what matters is how they work in the extreme case, and the extreme case of a major banking crisis. And the question being, think of Ireland in 2010. Cost of this banking crisis has been 40% of GDP. So the same number for Korea. So certainly the BRRD, all the systems that have been put in place, saying that the public finances should not be the first line of defense. It should, there should be much more involvement of the private creditors, is a protection. Nevertheless, the question remains: what, in the extreme case, and who is going to shoulder this extreme risk? And as long as it is the national sovereign, the risks remains and the weakness remains. So what does it mean to address that? It means exposure limits for banks. So exposure limits to any particular borrower, inevitably meaning their own sovereign. And it means, as a quid pro quo, a more common backstop and a real full common backstop. This raises major issues. I don't think it's an easy thing to do. Part of these issues are the legacy issues are going to come back to. But part is that it raises other systemic questions. And these systemic questions are about the insolvency regime for sovereigns. It's a hard question to address, and it's a question that is often addressed in an exceedingly simple way. I'm referring here to what people often say about the US. They say, oh, the US is so simple. The US system is so simple, a state can go bankrupt, and this is no big deal. There is no bailout. It has been enforced in history. So now the rule is clear, and everybody knows that a state can go bankrupt. Now, what is a US state? It's a minor financial player in terms of the size of its debt. The debt of the state of California is nothing compared to US GDP. The debt of Italy is 18% of Eurozone GDP. So part of that is legacy. Part of that is that the debt of Italy is very high. But part of that is just linked to the fact that the fiscal actor is and is going to remain the sovereign. And that stabilization is and is going to remain also very much dependent on the sovereign. So we can't assume that we would have the sort of structure of the US without having the federal budget that the US has. So this model doesn't really respond to the questions we're facing. So I think what we need is to have exposure limits for banks and a predictable regime for how to deal with sovereign insolvency. By predictable, I don't mean automatic. I don't think we need to be saying any states reaching 90% of debt to GDP ratio has to be restructured. But there should be procedure for dealing with that. We can't continue saying this is exceptional. What's happened with Greece is exceptional. Won't happen again, and excluding any thought about how to deal with it. So this means principles. This means benchmarks. This means procedures, and that's part of the answer. Now, what immediately when you say that, you're saying that the fiction that the state debt is a safe asset and that any state debt is a safe asset has gone for good, which raises the question of what is the safe asset in a system like that. And this is a very difficult discussion because immediately people think about Eurobonds and about mutual guarantee. There are other ways to create a safe asset. There is some sort of safe asset, which is the ESM debt, and that's a genuine federal debt. There have also been a number of proposals to create synthetic safe assets by trenching and creating a sort of super safe categories of asset that would serve the financial system. But that's not a discussion we should be avoiding because the completeness also requires that. And finally, I think this raises a question of who should be providing stabilization in a system of this sort. The Maastricht regime, the Maastricht assignment, was very clear, in effect. I mean, the idea was the national sovereigns are going to provide stabilization to the extent needed as regards asymmetric shock, mostly, monetary policy being in charge of symmetric shock. And they're going to be able to do that provided they abide by the rules of the Stability Pact. The thing is that it was predicated on a much too benign view of the range of macroeconomic situations we could be facing. It was assuming that provided you're at the top of the economic cycle, you reach sort of the small surplus, you would be able to provide the degree of stabilization that is needed. And in the crisis, we discovered that the size of potential shocks was much larger. And we have discovered since that in a situation where the monetary policy reaches its limits, the needs for a fiscal stabilization instrument at Eurozone level arises to an extent that was not anticipated before. And if we are in a situation where interest rates, real interest rates, are going to remain very low, the question of the fiscal instruments will be with us for some time. So there is a question here that has to be answered. Part of the answer that is being proposed is a federal budget. I have sympathy for the idea that the Eurozone may need a federal budget for the financing of some public goods at Eurozone level. This will raise lots of questions about what belongs to the Eurozone, what belongs to the EU. But you can't exclude that. Now, from there to the view that it's going to be the Eurozone budget that's going to provide the stabilization at Eurozone level, there is a long way to go. And I don't think a budget should be based on the view that there are stabilization needs. A budget is based on the public good you want to produce, the transfers you want to organize. It's not based on a sort of very macro view of what would be desirable from a stabilization viewpoint. There is also the possibility, and that's being discussed, and I think that deserves being discussed and thought out, the possibility of having a common contingent borrowing capacity, a sort of Juncker plan, being with real borrowing capacity, because it's not the case of Juncker plan, that would finance contingent investment programs in response to adverse economic shocks. And I think that's not a very remote question. The question, what do we do when the next recession hits, is there, and I think we should be giving thoughts to the answer. Now, let me finish with two things. One is the legacy. I mentioned all the legacy issue, by which I mean debt. I mean creditor versus debtors. I mean competitiveness, competitive versus uncompetitive countries, etc., banks. We all know that these issues are very controversial because the veil of ignorance has gone, and you know exactly who is in what position, and so it's an awful negotiation about interests. And history has told us that these discussions are always awful. I don't think they should stand in the way of a solution to the systemic problems we're facing. We should be looking first at the systemic issues, and then, having reached at least a compromise and a template on a blueprint for the future, we should address the legacy issue. Doing the other way around, starting with the legacy issue, is a sort of sure way not to go very far, because we will be immediately in opposition on everything, and it's unavoidable because it's a matter of interest. It's not a matter of visions. It's not a matter of concept. Sorry, my time is finished. So that's. That I think is important, and it's not really the strategy we're facing now. The strategy with the 5 Presidents report has been to start from the existing set of issues, because they thought that having too much ambition would be dangerous. I think it's the other way around. We need to be ambitious. So let me conclude, and I wanted to conclude by drawing lessons from the way in this country you're dealing with economic discussions. I think we should learn from it in Europe. I mean, I admire your ability to have controversies, to sort out the controversies by having serious discussions, and I look back at the report, or at least at the summary by LARS CALMFORS, because the report, I was not accessible in English. The report you did in '96 on membership of EMU, and the fact that you were able to have this discussion with the the governor speaking against the view of an experts group reporting to the government, all that based on comprehensive research. And this quality of debate is something that we're missing often in our country, and that also we should develop in Europe. So we need more analytical discussions. We need to be able to make clear that we disagree on some things, find out why we disagree, try to sort out this disagreement, and we don't have enough of those sound controversies in Europe, and I think that's something we should learn from really Sweden. In the Eurozone, we lacked the discussion before that would have prevented us from making serious mistakes. We have been slow in correcting our mistakes. The discussion we should be having about the future is hostage of too many short-term interests. So really, it's too serious an issue to be dealt with in this way, and really we should learn from what's being done here, put forward ideas, discuss them, agree or disagree, but clarify essentially what are the issues and what is the nature of these agreements. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I hope we can live up to them. We will certainly do our best. KAROLINA EKHOLM, please.
Yes, and I had prepared a few slides, but let me first thank Jean for a very interesting presentation. I am going to say a few things about the Swedish government's view on some of these issues. Well, I have to be brief, obviously, since I have about 10 minutes, so it's not going to be a sort of a fully fledged presentation of the government's view. But let me start by saying something about our view on EU in the sort of the broader sense, in light of course, the outcome of the British referendum. Then I think it's important for us to clarify that we think that EU is important for solving Europe-wide problems, and there are a number of important such problems that needs to be dealt with. I mean, currently we have the refugee crisis. We have internal and external security threats from terrorism that Jean was alluding to. But there are also more sort of long-term issues related to internal markets, obstacles to market integration. There are issues about tax and regulation competition. Those kinds of issues have to be solved at the supranational level. And we think it's important to focus on delivering solutions to such problems, and that I think arguably there's been too little focus on that in recent times. There's a lot of focus on protecting national interests at whatever cost, and at least in my when I go to Brussels, there's a lot of time spent on fiscal and economic surveillance, as also Jean was talking about, something that has grown and become very complex, and it's not clear that it's well spent time. Then another important aspect of this is that we now have a union that includes member states that are quite diverse. And I think this diversity justifies also different speeds of integration. And you see that I have included a map on this slide, and you probably immediately identify that the green countries are Euro countries, and the red countries are non-Euro EU countries. But you also see that there are some black countries or dark grey, so that's non-EU countries that are part of Schengen. And the Schengen area includes a subset. I mean, it's most of the Euro countries, but not all of them, and some notable non-Euro countries are also outside the Schengen area, such as the UK. Then we have other areas with more integration. The banking union was mentioned by Jean. It now consists of Euro area members only, but it is open also to other countries, and some non-Euro countries have also expressed some interest in participating. We have enhanced cooperation in areas such regarding the financial transaction tax. So there we have a subset of about 10 countries that, well, they haven't introduced it. They're still debating about how to do it. But nevertheless, I think the way the union looks today, there are these different speeds of integration, and we think that that is important to allow countries to integrate in their own pace. When it comes to EMU deepening, I think first it is important to realize that a well-functioning monetary union is of crucial importance for the well-being of the Swedish economy. The euro area is our most important trading partners on the basis that it includes countries in geographical proximity, and the well-being of our neighbors is always going to be important for the well-being of ourselves. But for us, a question that needs to be addressed and clarified is how we think that the EMU can be strengthened without this leading to a reduced influence for ourselves in the union. The more the Euro countries cooperate with one another, the larger the risk that important decisions at EU level will be taken within the group of Euro countries. And Sweden really wants to be an active member of the union, in spite of us being outside the euro area, and it looks likely that we are going to remain outside the euro area for the foreseeable future. Now, so one important part of this is that if there are new areas of cooperation set up, that those would be open also for non-euro countries, so that we could choose to participate if we want to. And finally, let me say something about our perspective on Brexit and the outcome of the British referendum. Of course, this is quite a significant blow to all parties involved. But for Sweden, it really means losing a like-minded member in several important areas. One important area is our view on the EU budget. I think that both the UK and Sweden typically belong to the members that have a quite restrictive view. It's natural because we are net contributors to the budget. So it's not in our interest to have this budget expanding without there being strong reasons for an expansion of this budget. I think we're also more open than some other member states to change parts of the budget that are considered a bit sensitive, such as agricultural support and the structural funds. We have similar views on trade, so we tend to be pro-free trade. And we typically also are like-minded when it comes to proposals that tend to transfer powers from the national to the supranational to the European or the EU level. That is, of course, justified when there is a clear EU aspect and there are some cross-country aspects to the issue. But for us, it is important to respect national competence in areas where national competence is sort of the correct level of decision. When it comes to the negotiations that are supposed to take place at some time in the future, not clear exactly when, our position is that there's no reason to punish the British for wanting to leave. I mean, that means there's no reason to offer a very poor deal to the British just to signal that leaving the EU is a very costly endeavor, and to sort of try to limit any contagion regarding this. But on the other hand, we don't see that there is any reason for offering a particularly favorable deal either. There's no reason to offer a more favorable deal than another non-EU countries would be given. So we do subscribe to the view that there shouldn't be any cherry picking, and that a full access to the single market requires respecting all the 4 freedoms, that is including free mobility of workers. So that was what I was going to say. And again, many thanks to Jean for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you very much. Lars, please.
So, thanks, Jean, for an interesting speech where I share many of the conclusions, especially the one that everything will be solved if everyone becomes Swedes. I like that. I'll divide my comments into 2 parts, one on EMU in particular and one on EMU on the EU in general. And then I'll start with the 5 presidents' report from 2015. Let me see. I don't manage to... yeah, I'm using this one. Yeah, anyway, I'll go on. I'll start with the 5 presidents' report, which outlines integration, how that should proceed in the monetary union, a deepening of integration. And then the idea is to have both fiscal union and to have banking union. Now we have it working. So fiscal union means more of common fiscal policy decisions. And then in the end, the idea is to have a common Eurozone treasury. They also argue in favor of a common stabilization function. When it comes to banking union, the 5 presidents want to complement the single supervisory mechanism and the single resolution mechanism with permanent access to credits from the ESM, the rescue fund, to guarantee sufficient resources. And then there are also proposals on a European deposit insurance system to reinsure national deposit insurance schemes if they are overwhelmed. Now there is a logic to fiscal union. You can say that centralizing fiscal policy decision that addresses the moral hazard problems created by the setting aside of the treaty's no bailout clause. But the problem is the political feasibility. I mean, more fiscal policy integration, that's totally out of sync with the EU skepticism that we see all over Europe, the support for EU critical parties. This is a recent opinion poll from Pew, which shows that there are more citizens that want to transfer power back from the EU to national governments than the opposites. So here I think those that are arguing in favor of more federalism, like the 5 presidents, I mean, they are really living in a, to quote Angela Merkel, in a parallel universe. I mean, this is just not politically feasible. And I would in fact even claim that the existing EU fiscal policy rules are not politically feasible. As we heard, during the euro crisis, rules were toughened, but they still suffer from the basic timing consistency problem that they are hard to apply in a short situation. And we've seen this very recently when the Commission and the ECOFIN Council just backed down on fines for Portugal and Spain. Not to mention the silk gloves with which France and Italy are treated when they violate the rules, which they are constantly doing. So, what conclusion should one draw from this? Well, personally, I'm leaning towards the view that this idea of financial sanctions is not just working. They are just impossible to use. Using them will provoke too much dissent, and that's the reason why they are not used. So I agree here very much, I think, with what was one of Jean's messages, that in order to go forward, you have to go backwards. That is, instead of trying to accomplish more fiscal policy integration, one has to rely more on stronger national fiscal frameworks, which have been accomplished in recent years, partly due to EU initiatives. And I think one simply has to recognize, and I guess that was in a way what Ron said also, that the fiscal policy debate is mainly national, that the incentives for fiscal disciplines also have to be national, which then includes, as you mentioned, independent fiscal institutions, fiscal councils that have a legitimacy in the national debate. So I think there is really an argument in favor of renationalization of fiscal policy. And I think the role of the common European rules should rather be to support and increase the legitimacy of the national rules. But to do that, I think the rules must be made simpler. You already touched upon this. I mean, they are so many, they are so complex, they are just impossible to remember. And this means that they can't have any clout, they can't have a strong impact on the national debate. This picture, I will not try to explain it. It just gives a visual impression of the complexity of the EU rules. I mean, it would take me the rest of this seminar and even more if I were to explain it. So just note the complexity. The problem with renationalization of fiscal policy, that's of course a moral hazard problems following from the bailouts that have been undertaken. So if renationalization is to work, then the credibility of the no bailout clause must be restored. And I think this requires two things. Jean already spoke of them, though in somewhat different context. We need the establishment of a procedure for restructuring of a member state's debt if that becomes unsustainable. Not easy, but we need it. We also need to complete the banking union, more resources for recapitalization of banks, and I think we need this European reinsurance mechanism for national deposit insurance schemes so that one can handle the consequences for banks of write-downs of government debt. And I very much agree on the need for limits on the exposure of banks to their own sovereigns' debt to reduce their vulnerability. So I think this is the recipe for the future. Less integration of fiscal policy, at the same time more integration in the financial area. And I think judging from what has been achieved in the financial area with the banking union, it is much easier to centralize decisions there than it is with fiscal policy. So that was what I wanted to say about the EMU. So let me then turn to the future of EU as a whole after Brexit. And I mean, I do believe, like most of you, that the EU can survive without Britain. But of course, the main threat is if Brexit triggers more exits, if we get the Frexit or Nexit, Hexit, whatever, or what have you. So I think one has to contemplate why did we get Brexit? And of course, then the best thing for the future, that would be if one could ascribe Brexit to the peculiarities of the British And I guess to some extent one can. The British are rather peculiar, especially when it comes to Europe. So UK was the country, in fact, with the least positive attitudes to EU at the time of accession, except Sweden, but Sweden is a special case. But it stayed like that in the UK. But unfortunately, it's not only that. The crucial factor behind Brexit, that was discontent with immigration from Eastern Europe, which is ironical, because the EU, the UK was the main proponent of EU enlargement. That was seen as an insurance against too much deepening of integration. But then enlargement meant these large migration flows to the UK, in particular, from the new Eastern European members. And it was this migration that turned the British against the EU. And I think this is something that could happen in other EU countries too. And I think it raises very awkward questions. Is public opinion in many EU countries still not ready for free labour mobility? Could free labour mobility even threaten the very existence of the EU? Does this mean that we might have to accept emergency brakes on intra-EU migration of the type that David Cameron tried to negotiate? And I really think these are awkward questions because they go against sort of one of the fundamental ideas behind the EU. The way I think about it is whether such emergency brakes are necessary for the time being, for the EU, so to speak, to survive, to live another day, until public opinion changes. Perhaps free mobility of persons to some member states has to wait until the electorate is ready for it. And we know that younger people are more positive to this than older people. So, I mean, there is hope for the future, but EU must survive till then. I also think that all this has a bearing also on future enlargements. So the question is if Albania, Macedonia, other countries in the Balkans, if they join, should there be long transition periods for mobility of labor from those countries? I also think an issue in this context concerns the common asylum policy. I mean, of course, a common asylum policy is morally justified. It would mean that we admit more refugees. It would mean a more equitable distribution. But if one forces reluctant countries to admit refugees, that could turn these countries against the EU. So it's a very difficult trade-off there, I think. Last point. Let me get back to the euro. I think it's a paradox that support for the euro has held up also in the crisis countries during the euro crisis, at the same time as attitudes to the EU in general have become more negative. How should one look on that? Well, I think a possible explanation is that the costs and uncertainties of abandoning the euro are just regarded as too large. So it may be the case that sharing the euro works as a kind of insurance against leaving the EU, which some countries then may need. Sweden probably doesn't. I mean, we are also peculiar. It's not only the British. I mean, we have moved from being a country with very negative attitudes to the EU to one with quite positive attitudes. So, other countries may need the euro to stay in the EU. Sweden probably doesn't. Thank you. I end there.
Have all the three of you on stage. I would like to give Jean the opportunity to comment and while the audience is preparing questions and comments, and throw in one, it's not a small question either, but one which has been touched upon. And in another debate earlier this week, I heard somebody saying that the rational response for the EU now would be to, in old Western movies, when the Indians were coming, they were putting all the wagons in a circle, sort of, to keep the enemy out, to sort of have only no talk of two-speed Europes or multi-speed Europes, or sort of, while Karolina was commenting a bit in that dimension, sort of having the Euro countries, the EMU countries, which will be a smaller group after Brexit, but sort of still being different. This other debate that was hinted that countries like Sweden should seriously consider both joining the EMU and joining the banking union, and sort of making it more homogeneous, the EU more homogeneous group of countries. I would sort of be interested in hearing your comments on that debate, as well as any other comments you may have on the introductions.
No, I agree that so far we had EMU, which represented the majority of EU countries, and then a significant subsegment of the EU of countries not willing to adopt the euro, at least for the time being. And that was not a very easy combination, but there was a sort of a balance. Now there is definitely, with the UK leaving, the group of EU non-EMU members is going to shrink significantly in terms of economic weight. And so we have to be very, very careful not to create a sort of excessive imbalance between the EMU countries and the non-EMU countries. This will require a lot of discipline on the part of EMU countries. I think we discussed, we can have different views on exactly what is the type of integration that's needed at euro area level, but we all said that some moves are necessary. But it has to be very disciplined that the moves that take part at euro area level are consistent with the sharing of a currency and do not go beyond, and that it's not used as a conduit for something else, because that would create difficulties. But it's not going to be an easy conversation.
Lars?
Yes, I mean, in principle, I'm in favor of sort of a multi-speed EU. But I think there is a very difficult trade-off that what we will get is different combinations of countries sort of cooperating more in different areas. And I think this goes against the very idea of our wanting to build a kind of European identity when we sort of get very different combinations of countries. So I really think this is a tricky issue.
Karolina?
Yes, no, I mean, I think this for countries such as Sweden, there's exactly this sort of worry that, on the one hand, the costs of being outside the euro area becomes larger, because in this process, more and more of the important decisions are taking place in that group, and at the same time, I think the public support for a possible Swedish membership in the Eurozone has gone down quite considerably. I mean, just right before the euro crisis, I think for the first time since the referendum, there was a majority that claimed that they would actually be in favor of Sweden joining the euro area. But when the euro crisis hit, then of course now there's a very strong majority that claimed that in a new referendum they would vote no. So, I mean, politically that would be unfeasible given the way the public opinion looks like today.
And it's not an issue in the Swedish debate at all.
No.
Right now. Lars?
Yeah, one point that I forgot about, I think that there are strong arguments for why Sweden should join the banking union. I mean, we are very exposed, and there are benefits of joining also for a non-Eurozone member. But of course, the problem then is that now the final decisions will be taken by the governing council of the ECB, where we only have Eurozone countries. So somehow one would have to solve this issue of decision-making.
Karolina?
Yes, I think, I agree with Lars that fundamentally Sweden would be one of the countries that could benefit from belonging to the banking union. We have a large financial sector being in relation to our economy. And I think for us, it is very regrettable that it was set up as, partly as a way to deal with the crisis situation, and then there was no time to do treaty changes, and the single supervisory mechanism ended up in the ECB, which makes it impossible for the non-euro countries to sit at whether sort of the final, or at least formally, the final decisions would be taken. And, there have been discussions about whether one could work around this in one way or another. But ultimately, if you're going to let decisions with such, so if the supervisor decides to close down a sort of a systemically important bank, that's something that you need to feel that you are in control of. And that makes it very, very difficult for Sweden with this kind of governance structure.
But this is a question that will be on the agenda in years to come, or?
Well, my impression is that there's no appetite for changing the governance structure. There's no appetite for making treaty changes. That's another, I guess Jean was also discussing, which makes it sort of very limited what the ideas that you can bring forward.
Does Jean have a comment?
Yeah, no, I agree that there's an issue of principle. And on this issue of principle, I think it makes perfect sense for the reason you gave for non-euro countries to join the banking union. But then, evidently, the governance issue is a difficulty that, and there's past dependency. It could have been different this way because it was more expedient and more perhaps, it started a project that was born out of the euro crisis, so it was sort of natural to deal with it with euro area institutions. I don't think that the treaty issue is sort of a permanent obstacle. We are in a phase where nobody wants to discuss a new treaty. But I don't think it's going to be excluded forever. We shouldn't put forward the idea of the response to what we are facing is a new treaty. But we shouldn't, at the same time, we shouldn't exclude the possibility of at some point having a new treaty if you need to put into law something that on which there is agreement. And actually, banking union is a very good example because the legal basis for banking union is very narrow in the EU treaty. So it would be preferable to have a sort of broader, more comprehensive legal basis. Yeah. So that's not the treaty. That's more the past dependency on having created, given the ECB the role it has.
Okay, it's high time we open up for questions, comments. Carl Hamilton, for instance.
Yes, I was for many years responsible for economic policy.
I think.
I was for many years responsible for economic policy and European Union affairs in the Swedish Parliament. And I think there is a new situation now with the rise of nationalism in Europe and elsewhere. And implementation of the rules is very important in this situation, especially in a country like Sweden. Now we see that France, Germany, Italy, well, they have all these fiscal rules, but they are not being applied when it comes to the crucial moment. And above all, of course, the non-implementation of the summit decisions on refugees. I think this is extremely dangerous for the European Union. This rise of nationalism and seeing that the big countries do not apply the rules which they agree with at summit meetings and so on. It's just the Baltic states and other small and medium-sized countries that should apparently follow the rules. And that is, I think, a basic, very important factor for the European Union to dissolve unless it is changed. And it's so clear, that the refugee problems, that is about feelings. it's not about fiscal rules and such abstract things. It's about votes.
That did not at all sound like a question. But
it was a warning to the advisor of the French president and the French ambassador.
Does the advisor want to comment on?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on the rules. Yeah. I can very well understand. I mean, the rules are here to be applied. At the same time, the legitimacy of a rule also rests on the appropriateness of the rule. I mean, our experience in the euro area is more than go back to 2008. In 2008, the European Council decided on a European recovery plan. So all countries were told to provide a stimulus. Immediately, almost simultaneously, these countries were put in an excessive deficit procedure, and were told to consolidate. I mean, with a delay, but very short delay, and the consolidation had to start in 2011. And that was implementation of the rules, enforcement of the rules. And then we went through, I mean, we made a major mistake by not addressing the banking problem before the fiscal retrenchment, underestimated the state, the bad state of the private economy in a number of countries, believing that our problem was mostly a fiscal problem, whereas it was not essentially at the time a fiscal problem, with some exceptions, obviously Greece being an exception. So in my view, this has undermined the legitimacy of the rules. And we have sort of piled up new rules, believing that it was only a problem of enforcement. It was not only a problem of enforcement. It was also a problem of adequacy, of quality of the rules. And, you know, the legitimacy of the law rests on the fact that, I mean, you follow the law because it is the law, but you also follow the law because you believe that the law does make sense and that it provides an answer to the problems you're facing. When you're facing a problem with the legitimacy of the law because the appropriateness of what the law tells you is being questioned, then it's a serious problem you have to solve. I'm saying that, you know, I would willingly admit that my country is not exemplary in abiding by the rule, even if they are appropriate. That, you know, we have had a tendency of playing with the rule being at the limit, etc. That has not been healthy. But that doesn't remove the problem I'm mentioning.
LARS CALMFORS.
Yes, I will not issue any warning to the French government or the ambassador, but I'll leave that to Carl and Karolina, perhaps. But I mean, I agree. France has been a problem. I mean, we had the problems in 2003, 2005, when the rules were not followed. And we had the rewrite of the Stability Pact to sort of, help France and Germany ex post to adjust the rules to what had happened. That was not a good thing. And I think it's not a good thing how France and Italy are treated now with silk gloves. But I agree. I mean, there is also a problem with with the financial sanctions. And when Spain and Portugal were not fined now, that was explicitly motivated by Pierre Moscovici, another Frenchman,
official.
Yes, that it was politically dangerous, that it would provoke very negative reactions to impose fines in a situation with deficits in these countries and when they had made efforts to reduce them. And I think this is an argument that sort of proves my earlier point, that the financial sanctions are really not a sort of viable strategy. I think one has to rethink them, that they probably will never be used, and there may be good arguments against using them. But of course, it's not good to have them in the rule system and not using them or sort of bending the rules all the time. That is really a problem.
Karolina.
Well, I I think, I agree with Jean that there's no obvious benefit to absolutely stick to rules that seem to be inappropriate in a particular situation, or the world may be changing and what used to be appropriate rules may not be appropriate anymore. I accept that argument, but I think what creates a lot of tension within the EU cooperation is this sense that I think Carl was speaking about, that there's not really clear that there's equal treatment regarding these kinds of issues. That if you're a small or a medium-sized country, you are likely to be dealt with in a different way than if you're one of the large countries. And that is a big concern, and I think one source of frustration among, at least for people from the smaller countries.
Jean, I give you the last word.
I totally accept that. I totally recognize this reality and accept the legitimacy of what you're saying. You know, the rules are there for everyone, and it's not a matter of size. I think that the fundamental debate we're having is, are we in the situation we're in because of a failure to implement the rules, or because of some deficiencies that had little to do with the rules, that had more to do with the concept and the design of the system. And the risk we're facing is that part of Europe thinks it's because of a failure to implement the rules, and part of Europe thinks it's because of the systemic failure. And these are the two narratives. And if opinion, I'm not speaking of people like us, but I'm speaking of public opinion, starts believing completely different theories about where we're in the situation we're facing, then it's dangerous. It's very dangerous, because it makes impossible, to find the sort of solution we need to find.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Mats Hellström is my name. If we follow LARS CALMFORS' reasoning that there might be necessary with some emergency breaks for intra-EU movement of people, if that would be implemented, I'm quite sure it would be very difficult, and perhaps some of the new members would not like it very much, but if it would be implemented, how would that affect the negotiations with Great Britain? The principle is, of course, that access to the single market requires following the rules of free movement in EU. But if this free movement is somehow restricted, would that mean it would be possible somehow to meet between Britain and the 27 so that the Brexit might perhaps be avoided?
Who wants to comment, Lars?
Yes, if that were to happen, it would be natural for the British to rethink. It's always hard to judge politics, but it could be sort of an argument or motive for having a new referendum in the UK, possibly.
Jean?
It's difficult to judge whether there will be a rethink. I tend to doubt. I tend to think that some irreversibility has been created. Now, on the substance of the argument, I think we should recognize that the four freedoms, and I'm very much in favor, they have more to do with a political project of giving this freedom to everyone, to every worker, to settle wherever he or she wants and to look for a job, than with a single market in goods and services. There is no logical, or there is no absolute connection between the two. You can have a market for goods and services without having this freedom of going and looking for a job wherever you want. So I think it's essential in the freedom it gives to the citizens. And you mentioned the younger people. I think they consider that's part of their rights. Huh? They want to look for a job elsewhere. They just go. They cross the border. They go. They settle. They have friends there, and they start looking for a job. But this, this is not the single market. This is something different. This is something very important, but this is something different.
Lars?
Yeah. I mean, when I raise this issue, I mean, I really think it's awkward. I mean, I don't really like to have to raise it. So I mean, but there are two strategies. I mean, one is to sort of try to adjust to political realities to make the EU survive. The other is to sort of argue as forcefully as possible for the four freedoms and so on. I was thinking a lot about this when I was in Almedalen, where I heard Jan Björklund's speech, which sort of abstracted from all political realities, and it was just a sort of passionate speech in favor of developing the EU. And I thought then, well, I would like to be able to speak like this, but is it really productive? I mean, as things stand. So I mean, raising this issue, I feel really bad. I feel really unhappy. But still, I think we can't avoid the question.
I agree with you. I mean, what I said, I think we can't avoid the question. And we shouldn't argue that it's impossible to separate the two, because it's not logically impossible.
No.
Okay,
I mean, maybe one aspect that relates to the euro area is, of course, that if you would start to put up restriction for labor mobility, that would make it even more difficult to have a well-functioning monetary union. So I don't see exactly how that would be attractive, at least for the euro countries.
But labor migration, I mean, that's not an important adjustment mechanism within the euro area.
But so that's a problem.
It's a problem, but it wouldn't make a big change.
No, but the change that it would make would be in the wrong direction, probably.
That I agree, but it would be marginal.
Could I ask a question, since I don't see any more hands? There are at least two. Okay, let me finish. Two indebtedness issues still outstanding. One is the Italian banking system, with a debt problem that is not really resolved yet. And the other is, I think, Greece. Sort of whether along the road there will be a need for another debt write-down for Greece to make things sustainable. And my question is, well, A, do you agree? And B, what are the mechanisms to sort of solve these possible future crises? Do we have them?
Well, on Italy, I think it's hard to judge what the extent of the problem. I mean, Italy has been facing a very low growth. I mean, if you look at the GDP in Italy, and I mean, it's a country that performed over the long period. It's the country that performed the worst in terms of where is GDP as compared to GDP per capita as compared to the previous peak. So that's in part it's inevitable in a situation like that banking problems
you were right,
as a consequence. Now definitely the lessons, which was true for everyone, that banking problems have to be addressed first, and that at an early stage, and cleaning up the banking system is essential. That's a lesson that was not applied sufficiently by Italy, and now there are some problems that the size of which we don't know exactly, and which come haunting us and stand in the way of sound solutions and fuel this distrust in the risk sharing, because the risk is the perception that the legacy problems are still there, and that you're not going to deal with systemic issue. In fact, you're dealing with some transfers inevitably. I think on banking crisis, I like the sentence by Ken Rogoff that banking crises are equal opportunity threats. If you look in history, all countries had banking crises, rich and poor, well managed and not so well managed. So the logic of banking union is really that this is a threat for everyone, and that you can't say that it's implicitly transferred to some countries. Now the situation in Italy makes it more difficult. On Greece, I mean, there is a solution in place. I don't think it's an ideal solution because of, the headline figure still matters for investors, but there is a solution in place, and in terms of the burden has been alleviated quite significantly.
And so you think it is sustainable, sort of the debt burden is not too high to be sustainable?
If you're paying zero interest rate on your debt, it's
that helps
by definition.
Yeah. Okay,
it's not ideal, but it's sustainable.
Please.
Well, thank you. Yes, it has been mentioned that migration from East Europe has been one of the major reasons for the Brexit. So my question is, how do you see the migration from the Middle East, where we have war, when people are escaping from, poverty? And how should we treat it? How should we gain from it?
I'm more in a position to listen than to speak on this matter.
Lars?
I mean, the obvious or the answer you want to give is, of course, there should be a common asylum policy with an equitable distribution of refugees. But the problem is that there is so much resistance in some countries. So what will happen to the question is what will happen to the cohesion of the European Union if one forces this common asylum policies on the countries that are reluctant now. I mean, it's a very unfortunate situation, and it's sort of another trade-off that is, I think, very, very difficult. Then, of course, we have all these issues about integration, how to get labor markets to function, where I think, Sweden has, of course, a particular problem because we have so few low-paid jobs. We have high minimum wages, but this is an issue which so far is blocked by the blue-collar trade union movement in Sweden in a very unfortunate way, I think.
Karolina?
Well, I mean, on this, of course, the position by the Swedish government is that this is something that should be dealt with forcibly by the EU at that level. And as you probably know, there was this record high inflow of asylum seekers to Sweden last year. And of course, those numbers would be very easy to deal with at the EU level. But I think one reason why these refugee inflows has been considered such a problem is that it's become so unevenly distributed. So from that perspective, of course, we think that it's very important that all the member states face up to this and sort of offer reasonable conditions for people to be able to seek refuge.
Okay, we have run out of time. Thank you very much for coming. These are our problems that will not go away. So I hope we will have the opportunity to see you here in a not too distant future, because these are extremely important debates that we will love to keep having here. Thank you very much for coming.